How would it be now on the other side of this if you allowed God to love you? So, what would that look like emotionally? Igor?
You would allow the intensity of God's emotion to overwhelm you.
You would start letting God's emotions into you, wouldn't you? You would start letting God tell you what God feels about you. Right? Many of you are not doing that because what you do instead? You say, it's impossible for God to feel that about me. You've already got a heap of judgments about God, and you're telling yourself constantly that you're not going to be able to feel what God feels about you. Yes, you are. The only thing limiting you from feeling what God feels about you is your inability to be humble. In other words, your inability to just feel some things emotionally. Right? That's the only thing limiting it. God wants to share her emotions with you. And in particular, God wants to share what God feels about you with you. Right? But we're so focused on going, no, what my parents think about me is right, what my facade says about me is right, what my injured self is right. And we don't find out anything in those places about ourselves, really, because God is not allowed to share with us in those places while we're shutting down our emotion. For God to tell us the truth, we're going to have to be open to what the truth is about us. All right? You go.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a sweet feeling, isn't it?
Of course it's a sweet feeling, but it's also very emotional. It's also very emotional. And this is where many of us have a problem with understanding our emotional self. We're trying to shut down our emotions while at the same time feel how God feels about us. But everything that God feels about you is emotional. Everything. Right? So while you're trying to shut down the emotion while at the same time feel God, it's not going to work. Of course it's not going to work. That's why most of us don't feel it. That's why most of us don't feel what God feels about us. And do you know what we do instead then when we're not feeling what God feels about us? Because we're not feeling what God feels about us and we want to feel good, we start looking to our addictions to feel good. If you could feel how God feels about you most of the time, do you think you'd be searching for addictions with other people to make yourself feel good? Of course you wouldn't. So even our desire to have our addictions met is driven by the fact that we're denying the relationship with God and wanting our addictions met because they are the only things that make us feel good. But the person who can really make us feel good is God telling us the truth about ourselves. But you know what most of us feel about God telling us the truth about ourselves? What do you feel about God telling you the truth about yourself? Most of you feel that anything God feels about me is always going to be, it's going to be bad. God's going to warts and all with me, and it was only going to be warts in the end, is the way we generally feel, right? We only see what we believe that God sees us the way we see ourselves, or the way our parents saw us, or the way our environment saw us. And none of those things are true, but that's what we believe. And so we are not open to allowing God to give us the feeling about ourselves that we're desperately in need of feeling. And so what we do is we develop a whole heap of addictions to get them all met somewhere else. Instead, it would make more logical sense, wouldn't it, to start allowing ourselves to feel or attempt to feel what God feels about us. Now, I've been experimenting with this a lot in the last year or so, and it's really hard sometimes. It is really hard because inside of yourself, you have so many beliefs that are false about yourself, that every time you try to open up to one of God's feelings about you, you'll find that there's a whole heap of layers of feelings that you've got to wade your way through first before you'll let yourself feel what God feels. Right? So it's a great way to progress. Because you can feel this first and feel that and feel this and this belief that you have and that belief that you have all start coming up, and you realise, wow, I'm really closed to letting God tell me what God feels about me. And God tells you through the emotional experience. So in other words, I'm really closed to letting God feel for me what God feels for me and me receiving that feeling. I'm close to receiving the feeling. So if I allowed God to love me, I would receive, let's use the green, God's feelings about me. Now, as you can see, the majority of us are not doing that. And I'd put myself there in a fair portion of the time. The reality is we are so blocked to receiving God's feelings about us that we block that flow that's possible most of the time. Right? Now, when you've got very low feelings of worth, very low feelings of who you are, you've been shamed and guilted most of your life, of course you're going to have low feelings about yourself. And it's only your resistance to feeling that pain that stops you from feeling how God feels about you. Yeah, Mary?
I don't know if it's like that for other people, but I find I don't have the belief that God feels the same way about me as other people.
Yeah.
But because I don't want to feel the contrast between how I feel about myself or how others have treated me and the way God feels about me. So my resistance to the love is about my resistance to the grief that would be triggered.
Well, it's the resistance to pain, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not always our belief that God is exactly like our parents. Sometimes it's the feeling that we just really don't want to feel the truth about our parents.
True.
Yeah.
A lot of times the contrast between God's feelings and your environment's feelings about you are so great that it would automatically trigger your grief that you don't wish to feel, the pain you don't wish to feel. And so you, instead of allowing yourself to feel God's feelings about you, what do? You shut down God's feelings about you, and in the process of shutting down God's feelings about you, you are able to manage the pain of how other people felt about you. Of course, that doesn't work very well because at the end you don't get to receive any of God's love then. And remember that God's love is the transformative substance that operates upon your soul. So while you're doing this, very little soul-based transformation can actually occur from God's perspective. And then all of the soul-based transformation has to be on your own effort. In other words, you're on the natural love path, progressing, trying to make soul-based transformation on the natural love path when you're doing that. Right? Every time you refuse the reception of God's love, you are automatically on the natural love path. Right? That's the reality. And most of us are on the natural love path most of the time. And there are occasions in our life where we engage this process with God. And therefore we're on the path or the way, if you like, the way to having this relationship with God. I would also allow myself to receive God's truth about me, wouldn't I? Can you see that? I would allow God's truth to enter me. So when I've done something that's out of harmony with love, the more sensitive I became to God or in receiving God's love, the more I'd know it's out of harmony with love. So I'd automatically start knowing things that are out of harmony with love more than I did before. I would know when they're not right. I would know. I wouldn't have to ask questions anymore of other people. I wouldn't have to go up to Jesus and say, is this right or is this not? Because you would know, because God's already told you, right? Because you're open to receiving it from God. To be open to receiving it from God requires you to be the most humble, because all of God's transmission of truth comes through your emotional condition, right? When you come up to somebody else and ask them the question, you don't have to be very humble because they can just tell you, and you don't have to be open to the emotion coming from them. You don't have to be open to it emotionally. You're just hearing the words, right? When you've got a developing relationship with God, God is teaching you how to be humble, to be sensitive to God's emotions. And all of God's emotions are the most powerful, but also the most clear. So this is the reason why we don't understand truth a lot. We don't understand truth because we're not allowing emotional sensitivity to God's emotions. We're not allowing ourselves to be humble in our relationship with God. That's why we don't know what the truth is. If we were allowing ourselves to be humble in our relationship with God, God would tell us the truth every single moment. Then we'd know what God's truth is. And of course, then we wouldn't have to ask anybody what it is. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that there might not be people who come along into your life that will help you. It just means that your primary focus is your relationship with God, not your relationship with other people. So if you truly loved God and wanted love from God, these are just some of the things you'd be doing. Now, we can create a very long list here of all the things you could be doing from an emotional perspective that would help you open more to God. But you can see that it's a large part of understanding your emotional self. If you can feel the truth from God about you, then you'll find out about you far faster than you'll find out about you from any other source, including yourself. Any other source, including yourself. Because God knows everything about you. God created your soul. God created its potentials. God created the other half of your soul. God created everything that the universe in which this soul plays. God created all of the potential things that you could experience. God knows where you can go. God knows your future. God knows your past. God knows everything about you. Most of you have hardly any knowledge about your childhood. And the reason why is because most of you are in complete denial of the emotions about your childhood, but also because we're completely blocked to somebody, God, telling us about what our childhood was really like. If we let God tell us what our childhood was really like, we'll go through a lot of emotions, but also we'll get to trust God a lot more. We'll go, wow, that was true, that was true, that was true. Yeah, I remember that now. And you start to trust the person of God, rather than just thinking that God's some far-off being who has no personal interest in your life. God created a whole universe where God knows everything about every one of God's creations, every single one. What you ignore happening in the universe, and when I say ignore, like most of you tread on 100, 200, 500 ants a day, right? You ignore it. God knows every time that happened. God knows the transference of any energy that has occurred at any level, at any time, and in any minuscule degree. Right? These are things that are God's. So God knows everything about you. So what's the most rapid way for you to find out about you? Be open for God to tell you about you. That's the fastest way. It's far better than asking Jesus about you. Jesus asked God about himself, so why wouldn't you do the same? You go?
Just receiving feelings from God about you. God, do we receive just the pure, how he made us, feeling, or the
everything.
injured
And everything, yeah. God will show you, if you're open, God will show you everything about you, including all of your injuries, where they came from, what triggered them, what caused them, what in your side of your parents made them occur, everything.
As a feeling.
As feelings, yeah, always as feelings. Because none of God's communication with you is intellectual. It's soul-to-soul communication. It's direct soul-to-direct soul communication. This is why it's so important for you to understand your emotional self. Without understanding your emotional self, you will never be able to receive God's feelings. You need to be open to that. Mary?
Receiving God's love also sensitizes you to love. And so then you become even more sensitive to the areas where you're out of harmony with love. So God gives you the truth about your condition, but also having received the love, you suddenly become more sensitive to everything else with regards to love in your life.
Yeah. Yep. So we've lived a life of desensitization, and when you start like allowing yourself to be open to God's love for you, you start resensitizing your soul. And after a while, you become so sensitive. Like God's soul is very, very sensitive. Like I said, God feels every single thing that happens in God's universe, God feels. All right? That's how sensitive God's soul is. The most sensitive being in the, and in the universe is not the right statement, probably. The most sensitive being, universal being is God. Because God exists outside of the universe because God's created, but God's sensitive to everything that's happening in them. Right? And eventually you'll become just as sensitive. You'll become just as sensitive. You'll not only just be sensitive to your own feelings, you'll be sensitive to your partner's feelings, your friend's feelings, your children's feelings, your animals around you's feelings, the creatures around you's feelings, the nature around you and how that feels when we do things to it. You'll be sensitive to the feelings of spirits, the feelings of whatever dark spirits or bright spirits. It doesn't matter. You'll be sensitive to all their feelings. And you won't feel overwhelmed by it because your soul has expanded enough to process all of that emotion and feeling without you becoming overwhelmed. Isn't God's love an amazing thing? It allows that soul to do that.